So one of the most important steps is figuring out what exercise intensity your client needs to be working out at. And we have two different ways that we can do this. We can use a direct method or we can use an indirect method. During a direct method, you actually put someone through a graded exercise test and then you plot their heart rate against their VO2. And so using this technique, we would estimate that we would want someone exercising between 60 and 80% of their VO2 max. So if you look down on the graph, you'll see we have 60 and 80% of VO2 max. So we would go over to the left on the y-axis and we would ask that person then to exercise at the corresponding heart rates. In this case, that would be 132 beats per minute to 156 beats per minute. If you're wondering why it says METs and not VO2 on the bottom, is remember that you're not directly measuring the VO2 necessarily when you're asking them to do the exercise, but you can easily calculate the METs, or you could do an equation to figure out what is their actual VO2 at this exercise intensity. So you can go back and forth between these units. More often than not, you'll be using the indirect method. And in this method, you're using some math to calculate what should be the target heart range. So the first indirect method that this is showing is actually calculating what is called heart rate reserve. To calculate just heart rate reserve, you would take maximal heart rate minus resting heart rate equals heart rate reserve. So let's look at an example of this. Let's say my maximal heart rate is 200 beats per minute. My resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute. That would give me a heart rate reserve of 140 beats per minute. So what does that actually mean, that value of 160 beats per minute? Well, that's really your functional range. So your heart can beat from 60 beats to 200 beats. Sure, you could theoretically in someone else have heart rates that are below 60, but if 60 is your resting heart rate, you're never going to achieve those lower heart rates, which means that what is your functional range? Your functional range is just from 60 to 200, or a range of 140 beats per minute total. So when we use the Carbonian method to calculate target heart ranges, we're going to start by using the example of heart rate reserve. In this case, we would take our maximal heart rate, so maybe 200 beats per minute, and we would subtract our resting heart rate, maybe 60 beats per minute. This would give us a heart rate reserve of 140 beats per minute. Next, we would pick the percentages that we wanted to apply here. In this case, we could use 60% and 80% of heart rate reserve. So we would multiply that by our heart rate reserve value, 140. Now notice that the values you get here are very low. This should be a trigger or a flag that, hey, there's another step involved to calculating the target heart rate zones. And that last step is that you have to add back the resting heart rate. In this case, it now gives you very appropriate ranges for 60% of heart rate reserve and for 80% of heart rate reserve. Now, when you're using the indirect method to calculate ranges using maximal heart rate or maximal VO2, it works very similar once you know what the max value is. If you notice here, we have two different ways to calculate heart rate max depending on the age of an individual. But basically, in this case, you're just going to multiply by whatever the percentage is that you want. So for example, if someone had a heart rate max of 200, I would multiply by 0.6, and that would give me the heart rate target for 60% of the heart rate max. And the same if I was using percent VO2 max. So if you take a moment and you calculate heart rate zones using both the heart rate reserve method as well as the percent heart rate max method, and you try and use the same percentages of those two different variables, you'll notice that you get very different numbers. So you get a range of 144 to 172 beats per minute when you use the heart rate reserve method, and 120 to 160 beats per minute when you use the percent heart rate max method. Now the value of the heart rate reserve method is that 60 to 80% directly correlates to the percent VO2 max value. Whereas as you can see for the percent heart rate max value, that's actually not going to be the case because it's not taking into account the fact that we don't use those heart rate values that are below our resting heart rate. So instead, if I wanted to try and match to the correct intensity for percent VO2 when I'm using percent heart rate max, to achieve 60% of VO2 max, I would have to prescribe 72% of heart rate max to get the correct heart rate value for that range that's going to elicit 60% of the VO2 max. And that's real complex when we start thinking about the math, which is why the heart rate reserve method becomes a little bit easier. This is just a nice summary slide that shows the equations that you use regardless of what method that you're using. So make sure you review that and you have an understanding of how to do those calculations. Really the key difference is when you're using the heart rate reserve or the VO2 reserve, one, you calculate the reserve value, then you have to multiply by the intensities that you want to have someone exercise at, and then you have to add back the resting value. And that's what's really different from the percent max values calculations, is you don't add back a resting value. It's always important that you know who your audience is when you're prescribing exercise. Oftentimes, whenever we think of exercise prescription, we default to what is hard or what is easy for ourselves. For example, if you prescribe someone to walk at 3 miles per hour, that's going to look like a very different exercise intensity if someone is, let's say, 21 years old versus if someone is 80 years old. So the purpose of this graph is to really show you that all exercise is not created equal and how that is perceived as an exercise intensity. And it very much is dependent on what someone's fitness level is as to how difficult that exercise is going to be. Time is something that we want to balance with the intensity of the exercise. At the most basic level, when we're starting someone out with exercise, we want to start them out with short bouts of exercise and slowly increase the duration of that exercise. Once someone has improved their fitness, then we're balancing the intensity with the duration. So when intensity is very high, we might keep duration a little bit lower. And then when intensity is lower, we might extend that duration. And the idea here is that we're trying to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness and performance by pushing the amount of time that they can sustain high intensity exercise. So if you have to pick a basic recommendation for prescribing exercise to try and improve VO2 max, you're going to choose an intensity of between 60 and 80% of their heart rate reserve or percent VO2 max, a frequency of 3 to 4 days, and a duration of 20 to 30 minutes per session. And this just seems to be a sweet spot to be able to elicit those improvements within VO2 max. Now you can certainly prescribe more than this, but this is kind of our baseline of prescription of what will work for most people. These choices in frequency, intensity, and time are intentional. We're trying to balance the improvements in VO2 max and mitigate any sort of risk of orthopedic injury. So this is a great summary slide that shows, depending on what someone's goal is, whether that's improving their health, improving their cardiorespiratory fitness, or they're an athlete and they're really trying to improve performance, this gives some general guidelines of how many days per week should this person be exercising, roughly what's the amount of time of the sessions that they should be doing, and using that heart rate reserve method, what range of intensity should we be prescribing? So make sure you put a star in your notes for this slide because it summarizes that key information. And this is something you'll want to use for your case study projects, as well as in the future when you prescribe exercise. The topic of the type or the mode of exercise needs to be specific to someone's goals. If they have specific performance goals, whether that's just in general recreation activities or high performance activities. If they're exercising just for health, you can generally use a variety of exercise activities. Some of the keys is you want to make sure that it's safe for that population. For example, I wouldn't send my grandmother hiking in the woods. There's a high chance she's going to trip on a root and fall. But I would allow her to walk on a treadmill. But better yet, I'd put her on a bike because there's less chance that she gets her feet tied up and might fall. We want to make sure people are using large muscle groups and that it's rhythmic activity. And by rhythmic, we mean constant. So you're not stopping and starting many times. We want some pattern of constant activity at minimums of roughly 10 minutes. Ideally, we want minimal skill in individuals who are new to exercise. You can increase that skill as someone becomes more proficient. And this really needs to meet the needs and the interests of the client. If you want to prescribe swimming, that's great. But if your client has zero interest in ever getting in a pool, then that's not a good activity to prescribe to them. So you want to make sure you know what activities they like to do and that they have access to do, and then try and best match that to their outcome goals. As we think about the stress and the strain that we're putting on people, we want to consider the volume of exercise that we're asking them to do, which is the frequency, the intensity, as well as the time. And this is when you're looking in a given week or even in a given day if you're prescribing multiple exercise sessions in one day. So to calculate this, you would multiply these three variables together to get some sort of assessment of how hard was that load. And you can make that look a lot of different ways. So MET minutes per week is a very common way to do this. You can also do kcals per week, which would show you what the overall load of the exercise was. Certain different devices now will give you a load score or a strain score, and it's really just calculating these three things together. One of the more challenging aspects of exercise prescription is the progression component. We've already talked about increasing the duration before you increase the intensity, but over time you have to increase the overall volume of exercise that you're prescribing, and it's a delicate balance of not over-prescribing, but prescribing enough that you're maximizing the body's adaptation to that load. And we look at this in different types of cycles. We look at microcycles, so just 1 week of training, mesocycles, which are 1 to 2 months of training, and then macrocycles, which are 6 to 12-month training cycles. And generally, when we're looking at microcycles, we want to see a small build each week. When we look at mesocycles, we're going to see small builds and then maybe occasionally a day or two of rest, sometimes even a whole week of rest that will be built into there to allow the body to fully recover to the training adaptation. And then in a macrocycle, we'd expect to see a lot of peaks and valleys with overall the training load continuing to rise over time. And I'll show you a quick graphic of what that looks like. So if you take a look at this figure, you see that we have week by week that the training load is going up, and occasionally we have a recovery week that's built in. The blue line represents someone's overall load as that is increasing, and the orange line represents their overall fitness. You'll notice that the peaks in fitness occur right after a recovery week. And if you look over time, you'll see that those peaks are gradually increasing, which is what we want to see as we're increasing the load over time that someone is being exposed to. And notice these are very small increases in fitness.